Yes, it's What a Boast, a celebration of Reeves and Mortimer. Please welcome your hosts for this podcast, MJ Price and Paula Wiseman. Hello and welcome to Quad a Boast, a podcast dedicated to the work and genius of Vic Reeves and Bob Mortimer. My name is Matt Price, founder of the Reeves and Mortimer Depository of Curious Stuff Facebook group and occasional radio bloke.
And I'm Paula Wiseman, the creator of the Divine Comedians podcast.
Today we are joined by a man who has, over the last 30-odd years, worked with Jim and Bob in a variety of roles: actor, writer, director, producer, script editor, and stand-in man with a stick. He is also a prolific author, radio presenter, actor, podcaster, and one of the UK's greatest comedy writers and performers. Please enter the Novelty Island paddock, Charlie Higson.
Hey!
Hi, Charlie.
Hello there. Hello there.
What an intro! What an intro!
What a marvellous intro. I was just thinking, what a genius this man sounds like. Who is it? Who have they got?
So much stuff.
Who can it be? Well, as you can gather by that list of various roles you've carried out, Charlie, we'll just go chronologically until you want to wave the white flag and say,
yes,
that's enough.
We should make it through the first 6 months.
Yes. We get to 1990. That'd be great.
Yeah, so I guess we can kind of start off by going back to the beginning, I suppose, of your comedy career. Your partnership with Paul Whitehouse is quite well documented now, but can you give us a little bit of an overview of how the journey into comedy began? Obviously, you met Paul at uni.
Yeah, I met Paul at the University of East Anglia, UEA, in Norwich in 1977, which was before the days of alternative comedy. So the thought of getting on stage and doing funny stuff never crossed our minds. It wasn't anything that we knew anyone else doing. Nobody else in the university was doing it. I mean, if you'd been to Oxford, Cambridge, perhaps some of the other couple of posher ones, there may have been, like the equivalent of Footlights and whatever. But back then, if you wanted to go on stage and arse about and try and impress your friends and get off with women, and get off with women, you formed a band. And it being 1977, Paul and I formed a punk band called the Right Hand Lovers, which was fun. We were a student punk band in Norwich, with all that implies. And we lasted about a year before Paul and nearly everybody else in the band were thrown out of university for not doing any work. But I kept in touch with Paul over the years and we remained friends. Another friend that we had at university, in fact, he was in the band, a guy called Dave Cummings. His brother Ted was a big friend of a guy called Harry Enfield, who was eventually met him. I think we met him when he was still a schoolboy. He came up to visit. Ted and Harry came up to visit Dave. Harry was that much, few years younger than me and Paul. He eventually did go to York University, where they did have a performing tradition there, and he formed a double act there called Dusty and Dick, which was his route into comedy. But we got to know him back then just as a friend of a friend. Another friend I met at university was a guy called Alan Davidson, who was from Darlington. And Rick Reeves fans will know the name Alan Davidson as the name of Alan Davidson, the Filthy Fox,
Yes.
which is named after Alan, who was an old friend of Chin, as he called Jim stroke Vic Reeves back then. He was known as Chin. And I met Chin through Alan. Alan was a really good friend of mine at university. In those days, Chin was he was a wannabe artist. He was hanging around with other students at Goldsmiths. But over the years, Alan said, Chin's now got this character called Vic Reeves, Britain's greatest light entertainer, and he's doing these shows. And he said, they're really funny. You should try and catch him. Never got round to it. Didn't get around to it for a long while. I remember seeing Jim as Vic Reeves on the Tube, where he did they did a sort of parody of Celebrity Squares. I can't remember what it was called.
Yeah,
And he was kind of as Rick Reeves, but he was on a wire and he was floating around in front of these people.
That's right.
And he was asking sort of shooting stars type questions, like how long is the long arm of the law?
Yeah.
Things like that. And I remember thinking, oh, you know what, that he's pretty funny and very, very confident. I mean, it is half the battle, I think, in comedy and certainly stand-up, to be able to come out and convince the audience you are Britain's greatest light entertainer, even though they've never heard of you, and to hold your own with that audience. And he was learning his trade down in Deptford with pretty rough crowds, Deptford, New Cross area and round the Goldsmiths. So sometimes students, but sometimes rowdy audiences. And, whether there were 2 people in the audience or 100 or 200, he would still come out with the same chutzpah and the same shtick. And he has never been fazed by a bad audience. He almost relishes it. I remember years later we went to the Montreal Comedy Festival just for laughs. And the Brit acts tended to be a little bit more, a bit less mainstream than, the Americans all had this kind of down the line, very slick stand up. There were a few British acts who held their own like that. I mean, by the time we went, we were working with, me and Paul were writing for Craig Ferguson, writing with Craig Ferguson.
Oh, yeah.
And he went down a storm because he just was big and Scottish and understood that kind of showbiz thing. And on the back of that, he moved to America and worked in American TV for years. But going over with Harry and Paul, who were doing the DJs, and Vic and Bob, who were doing big night out stuff, the Canadian audiences were absolutely bemused. Harry and Paul went down like a cup of cold sick. And Harry sort of held his own. Paul, who never really thought of himself as a stand-up, as a live performer, he really didn't enjoy it at all. But Vic and Bob, the more that the audiences were stunned and bemused and had no idea what was going on, the more they enjoyed it. There was a tradition there that all the acts would do a kind of warm-up in a smaller local club, because the big gala festival is a huge theatre. And we went, Paul and I went along to see Vic and Bob do their bit. Well, Harry and Paul were doing their stuff there as well. And it was, I think, the funniest night I've ever had. We nearly died laughing, mainly because of the audience. Just because it was a year when a lot of the American stand-up comedians, who for a few years, because we used to go over there for a bit, the Channel 4 used to pay us to go over as writers to kind of work on this various stuff around the show. Anyway, for a couple of years, the American stand-ups had all been saying, "I took so many drugs last night." Hey, I slept with 30 women last week. But for some reason this year they were all saying, "Hey, I just got married." Huge applause from the audience, and to be showing the ring. Hey, you know what it's like when you're married. And they were all doing this kind of, I'm married now and I'm settled down and I'm grown up. So Vic and Bob come out. For some reason, just before they went on, there were 2 jugs of orange juice backstage, and Vic said to Bob, "Take one of these." So they went on a jug of orange juice, and the first thing they did was, I don't know if you've ever seen Jim doing his Tyrannosaurus impression, the sort of Ray Harryhausen Tyrannosaurus. So they went around the stage doing that for a bit with the audience. Oh, hey, where's this going? And then Vic goes up, said, "Oh, all right, I just got married. I can't do the accent." And we've had a kid, a little boy, and he's a crab called Ian. At which point, I think he had the crab in a handbag, which he'd also gone out as the Tyrannosaurus Rex. And he interviews. Have you seen his Ian the Crab interview?
Yes. Yeah.
It's about the arboreal forests of Scotland. So it's him interviewing this plastic crab in a handbag. And you know, it just went on from there as they descended more and more, and the more that the audience didn't get it, the more strange and deranged Vic pushed it, and Bob just went along for the ride. But you know, I mean, he's a steely performer.
Well, when you see Jim on the early late 80s shows like Jonathan shows and Jules Holland shows, and he never looks like a rabbit caught in the headlights who's in this alien world. He just does his own thing, and if you're aboard with it, then great. If you're not, he's going to do it anyway. So
yes, and that confidence, and it just wins you over, because you just accept, okay, this is Vic Reeves.
Yeah.
I mean, I think partly because he, you know, as he claims, he never really set out to be a comedian. For him, it was a sort of piece of performance art. But it worked, you know. I mean, eventually I went to see, on Alan's insistence, I went to see the big night out at Goldsmiths Tavern, which is where he sort of started as a full-on show. And there wasn't a huge audience there. I think it was possibly the last night he ever did there. I'm not, in my memory it was. And I was just blown away by it. There was no one else, certainly in London, doing anything like it. You know, he had a whole evening's entertainment. A lot of it was his mates coming on and doing stuff with varying quality, and him holding it together. And you know, just his frame of reference, the things he was talking about, the sort of mixture of high and low art, stupid comedy and very clever comedy. It was just the best thing I'd ever seen. You know, this was sort of late 80s, I guess.
Which is pre-Bob, I guess, is it?
No, Bob was there. So I'm not very good on dates. But anyway, and I said to Paul, Paul, you've got to come and see this. This is the most extraordinary thing. And he did. So maybe it wasn't the last night. Maybe the second time we went was the last night.
Yeah. So whereabouts were you in your timeline, Charlie, with regards to all that kind of stuff?
I'd formed another band at university, and then when I left university, I did that for another sort of 5 or 6 years. Then I became a decorator. But through all that period, I was writing, and I'd stayed friends with Paul, and we started to write together. Harry had asked Paul to write stuff for him, because Paul was your archetypal funny mate down the pub, but who didn't see himself as a writer or a performer. So Harry basically just used to nick everything off him and put it into his live act. You know, it was Paul who first did the impression of the sort of Cockney kebab shop owner, who became Stavros, and stuff like that. So, and Harry did his double act for a while. Then he did a solo act, which was not really impressions. It was character comedy, which again at the time not very few people were doing.
Yeah.
It was all sort of quite right on 80s stand up, quite political. So again, what Harry was doing, like what Vic and Bob were doing, was very different. And so Harry got signed on to do Spitting Image, to do characters on that. And he was very good, because you see, Harry has a talent when he does characters and when he does impersonations. He makes them a character. It's not just a voice.
Yeah.
So even though his voice is on Spitting Image, they weren't always, you know, a carbon copy of the original. There was character in them. So it allowed him to work with the puppeteers to make these politicians into funny characters. And it wasn't just, oh, I can do that voice. And so he'd asked Paul to write with him, and Paul came to me. I had an early Amstrad word processor, which, if anyone has ever used one of them, is a weird and primitive and clunky machine. But Paul basically came to me. He said, look, I want to write with Harry. I don't know how to write, and I don't have a word processor. You know how to write. You have a word processor. I'd been basically writing novels over the years. He said, shall we work together? And we'd always been able to make each other laugh. And we were both very different. And so I think what made our partnership work is that he was very instinctive. He came from a much more working class background than me. I was much more sort of cerebral and structural, and came from a more middle class background. So we could kind of both fill in the gaps of what the other one didn't. So I would sit and type, and we'd bash stuff out. And then when Harry got onto Saturday Night Live, as it was when it started, became Friday Night Live, he did Stavros for the first series of that, writing with someone else. And they were having to do sort of, Stavros was sort of doing political satire, which was really not what it was best for. But with the second series, Ben Elton took over that side of things, and Stavros was free just to do more social satire. And one of the producers, Jeffrey Perkins, who was probably the greatest comedy producer of all time, got me and Paul in to work with him and with Harry on Stavros, and then we developed loads of money off the back of that. So we were going down that route, and then we begged Vic and Bob and said, look, if you do more shows, we'd love to come and do Novelty Island or whatever, do anything. And when they moved to the Albany Empire, which was a big theatre, relatively big to where they'd been playing in Albany Empire. Is that Deptford or New Cross?
Deptford, I think, isn't it?
Anyway, the Albany Empire. And they would do these runs where they'd do several weeks on a Sunday night, and it would be the full evening's entertainment from some sort of 8 o'clock through to 11 o'clock, a completely new show every week. Now they had the Vic Reeves structure of running it like a light entertainment night. So they had Novelty Island, they had Judge Nutmeg, they had all the games and the songs, they had Man with a Stick. So they had this, well, as I say, this structure. So they simply could say, okay, this week in Man with a Stick, he'll be talking about this. And Novelty Island, we'll get whoever's around to come on and do acts and be guests, and Bob would come up with stuff. And they had a regular team of friends of theirs. They had Les was already in place. But it was amazing, and again, nobody else was doing anything like it. But because it was south of the river in London, the critics and the comedy critics just ignored it. They never went. And every week the listing, Time Out was kind of like the Bible of what, before the internet, what are you going to do tonight? Well, we're checking Time Out or City Limits, the rival one. And the listing for all it ever said about Vic Reeves' Big Night Out was Vic Reeves' Big Night Out, light entertainment. And that was it. Never got reviewed or anything, but through word of mouth, started getting really big audiences, and a lot of big sort of TV people started hovering around. And Paul and I would, we'd say, okay, what do you want us to do next week? And Vic would come up with something, and you knew it was completely off the top of his head. He said, could you be a man with 40-foot long trousers? That was more of a Yorkshire accent. And I'd say, yeah, okay, yeah, I think I could probably make that, because we'd have to go away and make all these bloody prop.
Right.
Is there anything else to it? And he said, and he'd say, yeah, it's got pictures of canals on it. So I would, so I then go home and try and make it, and I'd ring him up and I'd say, I can't, it's 40 foot. I don't have time to make 40 foot. Right, if they're just like 10 foot long. So yeah, that's all right. And so I'd make 10-foot long trousers and paint pictures of canals on it. And that would be
so
the
you
act.
become a comedy performer by accident, really, then, Charlie, by going on stage.
Well, totally, yeah. We just wanted to be part of it. And you could go on and do these daft characters, and it would just go wherever it went on the day of what Vic decided to ask you and what you came up with. And, a lot of the time he would give us something to do while he and Bob went off and changed into another character or got ready for something else. But mainly so they could go off backstage and drink heavily. Eat crisps. And I think they'd often deliberately drag it out so that we were on stage thinking, how do we keep this going? So, it would be something like, we wanted to do a dream sequence. You're Tanita Tickerham and you're Rick Wakeman, but you're not playing a piano, you're playing a lilo.
Off you go.
Up a step ladder. And you say, yeah, okay. And then what happens? And then, because then he would introduce this before he went off. And he said, yeah, and then Tanita Tickerham squirts you in the eye with some tart lemon.
Yeah.
And we'd try and string this act out, which wasn't an act, which he'd just come up with for like 5 or 6 minutes while they got ready. And again, the worse it went down, the funnier they thought.
Yeah.
And they were, And you know, they had a lot, as I said, a lot of their mates, mostly these sort of people from the Northeast, would come on and do these bits. And you know, there was always a great personality to whatever the bits they were doing. And you know, there's definitely a different sense of humor up in the Northeast, and different frames of reference. I think, have you had on Dorian, or are you going to have him on?
Had Dorian,
Yeah. Again, you know, he was part of that stable. He wasn't from the Northeast, but you know, he basically just had his act as the toff, and he would tell these awful jokes while the audience screamed at him to fuck off, which ran and ran. So there was all stuff like that, and it was just great fun, and it was so inventive and exciting and different. To have a completely new show every week was amazing. And the TV people hovered, and Vic and Bob eventually decided to go with Jonathan Ross for Channel X, and then they were tasked with making it what had been 2 hours, half an hour. I thought it just wouldn't work. I just thought, you can't do this, it's not going to work. And I really thought my idea of what they should do would have been like Saturday morning live TV, whether it's a kid's show or a student show or whoever watches those things. I said, do it live every Saturday morning for 2 hours. They didn't listen to me quite sensibly.
A bit like Tiz was.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing. And those shows lend themselves to that. You know, I mean, like Pee Wee Herman did in America. Amazing show, which everybody watched. But, you know, the TV being TV, they wanted to fit it into a box. And I think Vic and Bob I don't think they listened to me for 1 minute, but it was certainly less daunting to just say, okay, we're doing 6 half hours and we're not doing it live. We can edit it. And they involved me and Paul from the start. We did bits and pieces on the pilot. I remember on the pilot, Vic always had a very, very strong idea visually of what everything should be, which has been one of the big successes of everything they've done. And he wanted this all white set with Vic Reeves' Big Night Out written on it, as we're so familiar with seeing. And I remember the rehearsals for the pilot, we had this set, it was all going well. We went away and we came back for the recording, and the director had decided that the white background had looked a bit bland, so he'd got them to paint it. It was sort of textured reds and browns all over it, and Vic and Bob were absolutely appalled, and they filmed the pilot with that set, but absolutely hated it. And you know, when they came to do the series, a new director, they'd gone with a very, very experienced, very good director, but quite traditional. And it was like, I know how to make TV. These boys don't really, you know, I know what's going to look good. And he was wrong. And eventually the guy that they did get to direct it was much more just, he was a good director, but it was more like, I'm going to point the cameras at you guys and pick up this magic that you are creating. I'm not going to try and impose anything on it, which was great. And so Paul and I were involved in that from the start, doing bits and pieces. They would always kind of ask my advice on things. And just to backtrack, I mean, a lot of what they were doing when we were doing it live, and also probably a little bit on the show, was they really wanted to make things uncomfortable for me. So they laughed at me as this middle-class boy from university who was one of Harry Enfield's posh writers. So it was like, let's see how much we can embarrass Charlie. And they did all over the years. They'd give me, you know, if someone had to have their clothes off, or
I was going to say that, Charlie,
be molested by someone, it would be me.
I could think of In the Smell and Shooting Stars and Bang Bang, where you've been in a blonde wig and very skimpy undergarments and usually cowboy boots.
Yeah, there's a lot of cowboy boots involved.
Yeah,
there was a Ken Tussle, the wrestler.
Yeah,
he was in wrestling shorts. Yeah, he was a wrestler and an antiques expert. Yeah, so and then they got Paul to script edit one series, and Paul basically said he didn't really know what script editor did, and he had very little input, because, as I say, Paul is quite instinctual. So he was very good on, he would basically say, oh, Bob, just fall over again. So that was his input. And I can't remember, did I then take over the job?
Jack Doherty did
Yeah,
one
Jack
of the
Doherty was
series.
involved,
Jack
wasn't he,
Doherty
as well?
did
Yeah.
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 So, and really it was just help on the structural front. Really.
Yeah. One thing, Charlie, obviously you were working with Harry at the time, and it's about the same time as Harry Enfield's television program, I guess. So, and obviously you've got his performers, and a lot of them went in to be the Fast Show, and you've got Vic and Bob's perform, but there was very little crossover with Harry and Vic and Bob. I can only think of one time when I've seen Vic and Harry on the screen at the same time, which was a charity show, and they did the Four Yorkshiremen sketch, I think, with Eddie Izzard and Alan Rickman. So did Harry ever come and watch the shows with you, or was it?
Yeah, Harry was a big fan, but you know, I mean, he knew, as everyone else knew, that it was very, very different to what he was doing.
Yeah.
You know, the Vic and Bob world is quite a closed world, and it was always very difficult for anybody else to come into that and do stuff. I mean, even the stuff that Paul and I did was pretty minimal. You know, they found people like Fred, who did Les, and later on Charlie Chuck, who did Uncle Peter, and you know, they would find people that they thought were funny and clicked with them and would use them. And you know, there was, you know, obviously they're two completely different and quite big shows that you're not going to start interpollinating them. You know, I was probably by the end the biggest link between the two shows.
Before we move on from Big Night Out, I just have to mention your finest moment, I believe, which is hats off to Harry Nielsen.
Hats off to Harry Nielsen, mainly because it's such a great title for an act.
Yes.
And again, you can see it as one of those things that Vic just made up.
Yeah.
A great deal of sport, you know. And that becomes the act, you know, describing what it was. Is pretty much how he described it to me. And then, you know, in the script was, you know, when he hears Harry Nielsen, his hat flies off.
It's just a great punchline with the shotgun.
Anything else? Yeah, he shoots it. And yeah, I'm not sure it was actually a character that it did, but it was just a great name. And you know, those were huge fun to do. And as you said in the intro, I would occasionally on Big Night Out, if Bob had to do, well, often at the end of the show where they'd get people back on, and he might want Graham Lister to come on and do something at the same time as a Man with a Stick, because Man with a Stick, you couldn't see who it was. It was cheap for me to do it because I was on hand anyway.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone for a minute believed it was Bob. You know, I have different body shape to him and body language. But, it's one of the proudest things in my CV that I was occasionally Man with a Stick.
Of course, then they moved on to the BBC with The Smell.
Yes,
where you stayed on as a cast member, but also associate producer. What did that entail?
You know, I was there. I suppose I was doing script editing to start with, but then I sort of became, as I say, they would ask me for advice on things, and they would tell me what they wanted, and I sort of became the conduit between them and the production side of things, of realizing, okay, this is what they want. Is this clear? Talk it through. You know, and I could be up in the booth with the director and the recordings as a sounding board. Should we do that again? Should we go again? You know, is this right? Are we capturing what they want? And also working with them on the scripts. And you know, it became pretty much a full-time job for me. And I think on the first series that they'd asked, I was officially been script editor, but I said to Channel X, I said, look, I'm actually doing quite a lot more than this. Could I have some kind of a credit to acknowledge that? It wasn't any more money, I don't know.
No.
So because the director, very good director, John Birkin, was also the producer, but it was a lot of work. So it was kind of lightening his load and having a creative input on it. But the thing was, you know, then the scripts that they would send were amazing and incredibly detailed. And Vic had these amazing drawings and illustrations. Any prop he would draw in his inimitable style, and it amused him to put kind of too much detail. There would be, it would be a quiff, and it would say 17 inches, and a pair of shoes, and there would be sort of geometrical measurements and things like that. And a lot of the time, the people making these things, and they got an amazing team together of costume, makeup, and making props, doing the special effects and all of that. And it would be my job really to go around all these departments and help them interpret what Jim had drawn, because often they come to me and say, look, I've been working on this quiff. I cannot make it 17 inches long. I say, he just put that in as a joke. He doesn't know he probably doesn't even know how long 17 inches is. But just make it unnaturally long. And also a lot of the time it's trying to get people to make things not too slick, particularly on the makeup front. Is that the great thing about them had always been the sort of homemade feel when they made their own, like Brian Ferry masks and things, or the thing to squeeze the lard through for Graham Lister. And again, because of that, we have huge budgets. The makeup people, it was saying, no, if they want a cardboard wig, make a cardboard wig. And they said, but it's going to look shit. I said, yeah, that's part of the joke.
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, that was Jane Walker was the makeup woman, and she was absolutely amazing. She went on to do all the Fast Show stuff, and now does all the big shows like Game of Thrones and things like that. And she actually said it was really good for her to be loosened up, because she'd gone through that very rigid BBC training of how you do costume and makeup, and just to throw all those rules out the window and have fun with it, she found very, very liberating. And so it was my job, because Jim and Bob were very involved in rehearsing the shows and getting it all right, and I would then sort of interpret ideas they had. Well, not interpret, but then have to go around everybody and make sure that those ideas everybody is on top of. And putting in my sixpenny worth where needed. I mean, some directors would have had a fit and tried to kill me and throw me off. But John Birkin was lovely to work with, and he went on to direct first series of the Fast Show, because Smeloff started before the Fast Show, and he was a very, very thorough and meticulous director, and it was down to him that Smeloff looked so amazing. Those big dance routines and stuff like that, and the attention to detail in all the stuff that they filmed on location, like the little intro films that they made.
Incredible.
And on most shows it would be, we don't have time to do that, we'll concentrate on the big sketches, but John loved doing all those little bits and pieces and making them look as special as he could. So it was a great team that they got together, and it was hugely exciting to be a part of that.
And there's a lot of really small characters who have very little screen time, which you play, and the most elaborate costumes for a matter of seconds on the screen. Is that because you were there, and so we'll put Charlie?
Well, I was there, and I always liked dressing up, and I wouldn't mind spending the time doing that for like 3 seconds as a German with a beer tankard doing something.
That's right.
And I love doing those bits and pieces. So it's great fun to do. But at the same time, Paul and I, having done the Harry Enfield's television program, we put together the Fast Show. And I remember the first episode of the Fast Show went out when we were on location. It must have been series 2 of Smell of Reeves Mortimer. We were on location doing Slade on Holiday somewhere in a big hotel somewhere, and it was on late night Tuesday night, the first episode of the Fast Show. And we all watched it together. Paul couldn't bear the embarrassment and the tension of watching it with Vic and Bob. He's always good, but everybody enjoyed it, luckily.
Of course, the first Fast Show character I think I probably ever saw was Swiss Toni on the Smell of Reeves Mortimer.
Yes,
I think he came on the Fast Show to series 2. Was it the Fast Show? Swiss Toni's first appearance?
Was at least series 2. Yes.
Yeah.
Was it even series 3?
Might have been.
No. Yeah, no. I mean, that was just one of the characters that they wanted, and it was the Brahmin buying a nice car.
Yeah.
And again, Jim had done this amazing drawing of Swiss Toni. People often say to me, "Why is he called Swiss Toni?" And I said, "I have absolutely no idea. That's just what Vic and Bob came up with on their show when I did it." And there was this drawing, and it was pretty much like Swiss turned out, except the quiff was much bigger and more. And he had plastic bags tied over his shoes, which we didn't do in the end. And
he's got to get back to his
that.
eggs.
Yes, exactly. There was a bit more strangeness in their version of him. And if you look at the sketch, I, as often happened doing things with them, because I was such a fan, I couldn't stop laughing. And they had to sort of cut around it so there aren't as many 3 shots in it as there should be. To get for the comedy to work as well as it would have done. Comedy, it's good to see the comedy and the reaction at the same time.
Yeah.
Sort of thing. But you know, during the day, because there was a lot of hanging around, Bob and I were pissing around with this character, and Bob came up with all the stuff about making love to a beautiful woman, which wasn't in the original.
Yeah, no, I wondered where that catchphrase came from.
Yeah, and we did all that, but Paul didn't want to use the character mainly because he had this Dutch character who eventually became the sort of 2 Dutch policemen that he did on Harry's show. And that had been based on someone we'd met. We used to go over to Amsterdam quite a lot. We had friends over there, and he had done, you know, just a messing about like he always did to create characters. The sort of cool Dutchman from Amsterdam who smokes a lot of drugs, and he's always talking about the ladies and making love to the ladies, and pulling on my waders to go fishing is it's like with a beautiful woman. And he said to me, "Well, you just ripped off my Dutch character." I said, "Well, it's not exactly the same. There's more to it." He said, I don't. It's very funny. So I really had to fight, and you know, it was probably down to Bob's insistence, saying, "No, Paul, this character's really funny. You should do it." That eventually Paul relented, and we did Swiss Toni on the Fast Show, and Bob wrote all the filthy stuff for him.
Yeah.
I put in all the other stuff about him having a mental breakdown and all the stuff that no one remembers to make him more of a character. And Bob would just, you know, send in a few handwritten pencil scribblings of funny lines for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bob has to have an outlet for that filthy stuff. I think he does it on the podcast now. Just somewhere he can let loose.
So that he's very much a sort of portrait of Dorian Gray. On the fishing program, he's lovable Uncle Bob.
Yeah.
But he has other outlets for his dark side. But it's lovable Uncle Bob who is visibly turning into this aged
curmudgeon.
That's the national treasure. Yeah.
But he's got such an amazing eye for stuff. You can see why him and Jim clicked as they did. You know.
Yeah, and you know, and people will try and analyze comedy and say, why is this funny and why did you do that? And you know, most comedians will say, well, it just seemed to be a funny idea. Don't overthink it. And Bob certainly doesn't overthink it. Does. He's like Paul. He's very instinctive, and yeah, you know, because you know he like me. You know, he went along as he'd heard about Vic Reeves doing this show. He was a solicitor at the time. He went along and he just fell in love with it, and he saw something there that a lot of people hadn't, and you know, gave up his life as a solicitor and hasn't looked back. And yes, you know, they are a very good partnership. A bit like Paul and I are very different. He and Jim are very different. Jim will come in with this sort of, you know, ideas from the world of art and philosophy and avant-garde theatre or whatever. And Bob is just there as a bloke from the northeast who finds things funny.
So after the Smell, there was another appearance of one of the Smell characters, which was Chris Bell, in a pilot that you and Paul wrote called The Honeymoon's Over with Alex Lowe.
Chris Bell was in that. Yeah, with Alex Lowe, who went on to do what's he called, the old man?
Clinton Baptiste.
Barry from Watford.
Barry from Watford.
Barry from Watford,
Yeah.
yes.
Mm.
Yeah, it was. I mean, on the back of doing Saturday Night Live, and the huge success of Stavros, and then the massive success, the overnight success of Loads of Money, Paul and I became, we suddenly became in-demand comedy writers, and people wanted us to do pilots for them. Oh yeah, there was a guy called Seamus Heaney. Not Seamus Heaney.
Seamus Heaney.
Yeah, Seamus Heaney was running comedy at Channel 4 at the time. Seamus Cassidy, who was in charge of comedy at Channel 4 when they were doing Big Night Out, and he seemed to consider his job was to make sure that no comedy appeared on Channel 4. He would much more preferred saying no to things, but he did get various pilots made. I think
The Weekenders.
that was
Weekenders,
ours.
yeah.
Ours was the Honeymoon. They did the Weekenders, and we did this pilot called The Honeymoon's Over, which was sort of loosely based on our lives that Paul and I had in Hackney in the 80s. It wasn't the greatest script in the world. It was okay. It was just about two young people sharing a flat, and the various people I knew around about the place. Paul's heart was never particularly in doing because we did a couple of sitcom pilots, but Paul really loves doing character sketch comedy, and that's kind of it. He doesn't really want to do other things, but we did it and we had fun making it. And God, I'd completely forgotten that Jim was in it. And Mark Williams played a guy in the post office who worked alongside Alex Lowe's character and was very much into the Territorial Army. He was very similar to the character that Mark Heap played in Spaced, but I don't think
Nick Frost plays it.
Oh, Nick Frost, yes, that's right. But I don't think that Simon and Edgar and those guys had ever watched the pilot, because I don't think anyone did. But great minds stink alike. And it was one of those things that probably the incidental stuff in it was funnier than the actual central.
Paul's great in it, I think. He's like a squatter, I think, isn't he?
Yeah.
He
Oh
lives
God,
next
yeah.
door. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was one of those things where all the stuff around the central story was quite funny, and the central story was a bit kind of bland, I think. Alex Lowe was good, but it didn't go anywhere. But Seamus liked us enough to get us to do another. We did another pilot later on, and Seamus, because I know a few people told us that he was much more keen on me and Paul than Vic and Bob. I think Vic and Bob weren't as up for kissing arse as we were, perhaps. They were very much their own thing in their own world, not going to listen to anyone else, which is why what they do is so good. But anyway, there was it's those times where you're flailing around, you're trying things out, seeing where you're going to go, what you're going to do, and it was the Fast Show that eventually came together, and that's what we concentrated on.
So it's about this time in the mid-90s and Shooting Stars first appeared.
Yes,
which again you were involved as a producer on that one.
It was another sort of probably credited as something like associate producer again.
Yeah,
I was just there as advice. They liked to try things out on me. They would very rarely listen to any of my advice. But
but they obviously trusted your opinion.
They trusted my opinion, and I was one of the people who if I thought something was shit, I would tell them.
Yeah.
And they appreciate that and didn't get pissed off with me, because we had a working relationship when we knew how we all worked. But in the end, they would stick to what they wanted to do. And so I did. I was advising on that. I'd be there for rehearsals and on the evening of the recording. Again, I'd be up in the box with the director, making sure everybody was happy, everything was working. But once it was up and running, it didn't need anyone like me involved anymore. So as it went on, I had less input, but I always liked it if they rang up and said, could I come in and do this character that they wanted.
I mean,
and obviously that's where I got to know Matt Lucas and David Williams. Again, Matt Lucas was one of their finds. Bob had seen him doing Bernard Chumley
Yeah.
live, fell in love with them, and you know, as I said, if it was something that Jim and Bob saw in someone that would work with them, then it would. And so, you know, Matt fitted in really well in the way that other people just didn't always fit in.
Again, you ended up on screen a couple of times yourself. I think Han Solo, I can remember. Alan Ball, a footballer, maybe. And most notably, I think, is the male stripper on Ladies' Night
Yes.
episode.
Very.
Again, in a blonde wig and some skimpy shorts.
Yes. Limp
Harry,
and a chain hanging from my nipples,
Yes.
I think. Perry got quite excited by.
Yes.
But yeah, you know, that was great fun, and you know, they had extraordinary success with it, and in many ways created a new type of TV show, that sort of
Yeah, definitely
structured panel show thing where the guests are really part of the entertainment rather more than the actual input.
Yeah, there's a lot of trust involved, isn't there? There's a lot of trust involved. Obviously, you trusted their, you know, what they were asking of you. You know, you didn't really question what they were.
Yeah, well, you know, if things were going well, then you know, you could see that they were going well. You know, and you know, we did a couple of other things together which I had involvement with that didn't go as well. I mean, the ill-fated Ulrika, It's Ulrika show. Just you know, we could tell on the night of recording that pilot that it wasn't going to work, and Ulrika was a brilliant sidekick to have fun with, but she was not in the right place and was not enough of a good sort of character performance to kind of hold a show together, which you know, when people do it well, you know, like Vic does, it make it look easier. You just think, well, that's just something it's about, but it's extremely difficult to do, and it's a huge pressure. And Ulrika didn't enjoy it, and you know, the best things on it, Ulrika, are the little bits that Vic and Bob did, you know, like the Jimmy Hill dancers. And yeah, it was just too much for Ulrika to try and carry. So.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's either natural or it's not, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? You can tell when it's not a natural, a natural performance.
Yeah, but you know, the thing with Vic and Bob is that they always wanted to try and create a big mainstream BBC One primetime hit. And actually, they were pretty much almost there with Shooting Stars. It was huge in terms of numbers and popularity, but it was still BBC Two more than BBC One. But they really wanted to create, you know, that because they did that. I mean, you know, it's unbelievable today to think that when TV is so regimented and so driven by ratings and business decisions, that a show that what was it called? Their big
Families at War
got made. It was extraordinary. I mean, because it was mainstream light entertainment, fully butting up against the world of Vic and Bob. But you can see Bob particularly, and Bob's always been very ambitious, and he wants that sort of mainstream success. It's interesting when you look at Shooting Stars that Bob is actually trying quite hard to be an actual host of a quiz show. And
Bob had a go.
Jim is trying as hard as he can to completely undermine.
Yeah.
And Bob was always the one who was there thinking, I've got to hold this together because Vic could go off at a tangent at any moment, which makes it quite funny. But yeah, you know, when they did Families at War, Bob was fully convinced that they were making kind of like the New Generation game.
There's a number of episodes have turned up on YouTube now, and it is, watching them back, it is. I was in my mind they were very mainstream, but when you watch them back now, they are completely out there at times. And this is like 7 o'clock on Saturday night.
Yeah. Yes. So you know, I think everybody concerned realised that wasn't going to happen. What creative people always want is to create a franchise that can go out into the world and make money for them without them having to be involved anymore. So to create a show like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or Big Brother or one of those things, the creators of those shows make millions And once it's up and running, they don't have to do any more work at all. And, you know, that's what Bob has always wanted to create, something like that. But, you know, in this life, it's always the things that you don't expect to be a hit that suddenly take off, and the surefire winners often die. You know, it's interesting, you know, Caroline Aherne, who we obviously worked with on the Fast Show, she had huge success with the Mrs. Merton show. And on the back of that, she got a deal to develop 2 other shows for the BBC. One was a sort of reasonably straight Mrs. Merton sitcom, Mrs. Merton and Malcolm. And that was, that's the big mainstream hit. That's the one that everyone's going to love and watch. And then she wanted to do this thing called The Royal Family, which was going to be shot like a documentary. And it was just people sitting in their living room watching TV. And that was the weird outlier that, well, you know, it might work late at night, someone might watch it. And, you know, the BBC did try and steer it to being a more mainstream sitcom. They said, well, do it in front of an audience. You're really funny. You're great with an audience. Make it a proper sitcom. She stuck to her guns. And obviously Mrs. Merton and Malcolm pretty much sank without a trace. That wasn't what people wanted from Mrs. Merton. And The Royal Family became this huge success, and you know, this sort of central to the history of British comedy. But nobody predicted that in advance. And it's like Bob and Paul doing Gone Fishing. Nobody thought that would be a hit. It's just 2 old men whose heyday is long past, going fishing in some quite unspectacular parts of Great Britain. You know, it's not like they're going to the Grand Canyon or not.
No, but it's nice seeing Paul being himself. Do you know what I mean? You're seeing kind of behind the curtain.
You think that's what he's like?
Well, that's what we like to think that he's like.
But no, you know, and it was made. It wasn't made for entertainment. It was made through factual, and it was just going to be a nice little show on BBC Two that a few people might watch. Nobody predicted it would become a huge success, and that young people would love it as much as old people, and that people would react to everything about it that wasn't what modern TV was supposed to be. It was slow, not a lot happened, it wasn't flashy editing, it wasn't, and coming up all over, there's no narration, there's no voiceover on it, it's just them doing that, and people have absolutely fallen in love with it. And you know, Bob has found that mainstream hit that had always alluded it. Well, I mean, Shooting Stars was a pretty mainstream hit. So, you know, it's better not to try and cold-heartedly plan these things. I'm going to make a big show. They often come from the unexpected quarters.
Yeah. Going back to Shooting Stars, you toured with them with the Fast Show, a double header.
Yeah, well, it wasn't exactly a tour; it was a residence.
The Apollo.
We did 32 nights at the Hammersmith Odeon, which was a record at the time, and was pretty extraordinary, and huge fun. Yeah, I mean, Vic and Bob came to me and Paul, and they said, you know, they had done Shooting Stars, a little tour of it. I don't know, but back in the day, they'd obviously done big night out tours and things, which had been massive on the sort of the student circuit, and full like going to a rock and roll gig, because everybody was singing and shouting the catchphrases and were pissed and standing up. And you know, they said, oh, you know, we really want to do Shooting Stars live, but we know it won't sustain a whole evening. Because they're quite shoddy in their way that they put things together. And you know, it works well for half an hour or so. And they said, would you like to do, we do a show and we split the halves, we do it, because they'd been talking to the promoter, Phil McIntyre, about doing it at the Hammersmith Odeon, Labatt's Apollo, I think, as it was at the time. I don't know what it's called now. But my generation, we call it the Hammersmith Odeon. And it said, you know, we could do half show each. And we thought that was a great idea. There was a good guaranteed amount of money up front. And then they said, you know, can we go on first? Because ours is going to be pretty shoddy. And we know that you'll do a proper show, because you work much harder than we do. And that was the other thing, that over the years, from there beautifully, you know, you'd get 70 pages of script for Smeller, Reeves and Mortimer, with all these illustrations and drawings and diagrams and stuff. As they went on, the scripts got shorter, till by the time they were doing Bang Bang it's Reeves and Mortimer. It would be like Jim and Bob will now hit each other with for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, you would still get these flashes of brilliant. You know, some of their best stuff was on Bang Bang. It's Reeves and Mortimer, but
yeah,
it wasn't as densely made and thought through as some of the earlier stuff. But yeah, so for the Hammersmith gig, yeah, they basically went on and sat behind desks for an hour, taking the piss out of whatever celebrities they could get to turn up that night. They had a few regulars who came quite often. And you know that you would have 6, 7, 8, 9, up to 10 people on stage with radio mics at the same time, all shouting at once. It was chaos. It was great fun, but quite chaotic. And then our show would come on for the second half, and we'd put together a huge show with scenery, and we'd built a sort of fake proscenium arch, and we had a huge team of makeup and costume to do the quick changes for us, and we'd spent months writing it and rehearsing it. And I remember years afterwards, you'd meet someone and say, "Oh yeah, I was a big Shooting Stars fan. We came to see them at Hammersmith Odeon, but we didn't stay for the second half. We were Vic and Bob fans." Say, "Oh, we regret it now. I think it probably would have been good." But no, it was fantastic.
Did Vic and Bob stay for the second half?
They went to the
Did
pub.
Vic and Bob stay for the second half?
No, God no. Because they built this sort of nightclub in the car park behind the Odeon, because it was sponsored by the beer company, and so it was perfect for them. They could go on stage. They would have had, you know, like a pint of weak lager before they went on, and they'd have weak lager in their coffee mugs, and then they'd come off stage and just go back to the nightclub behind the stage with free beer with their celebrities and any other celebrities who turn up, and just get hammered. And so by the time we came up, there'd be this big party going on in the car park. But no, I mean, that was huge fun to do that. You know, every night you'd get the tube down there and rock up, and you'd know what was going to happen. You'd in your dressing room, there was a little bar backstage that we would all convene in. We would have a drink as well, and then get ready and do the show. And it, you know, that was fantastic. And that, I suppose, was a sort of coming together of things that had started in 1977 when Paul and I went to UEA. We met each other. We met. I met Jim, and we'd all worked together on each other's things over the years. So it was really fantastic to be able to do that live show where it was all of us together having a laugh. And I think one of the great strengths of the night was that the two halves were so different. You got a really, really good night out.
Oh, gutted I couldn't make one. Never mind.
Call yourself a fan.
I was there.
Ah, excellent.
I
I think before the internet.
Stay for the second
where
half.
Of course huge well, you know, I'm a huge Fast Show fan. So,
It passed me by.
it's like a dream. Do you know what I mean? The two of your favourite things in one night.
Yeah, you know, I don't know why people don't do more of that sort of thing.
Just last word on Shooting Stars. So several years later, you went back as a guest. What was it like being on that side rather than behind the scenes?
Well, it's a thankless task. You're simply there to make Jim and Bob look funny, and in fact, very few comedians did it, and they invited very few comedians on because the later panel shows were developed as kind of showcases for ways for comedians to go on and do their stand-up. But Shooting Stars, they just wanted people to come on and laugh at the jokes and get embarrassed and be made fools of. Occasionally they would have comedians on if particularly Bob, if he was just like a huge fan of someone, he would have them on just because he wanted to have them on. But yeah, it's not something that you could go on and be funny. So I sort of had to do my persona of the slightly stuffy middle class boy that they would like to take the piss out of. So
yeah,
but they had such a vast array of. It was like people were clamoring to get on Shooting Stars, weren't they?
Yeah, well, you know, it was good exposure, and the best thing was when Americans or people who didn't know the show were advised to go on by whoever was out there publicity and PR. You know, like famously Larry Hagman.
Yes.
And they were always the best guests who were just bewildered. And somebody said, "Yeah, it'd be really good for your profile to go on there." I remember the very first show they had John Peel on, and it was always decided in advance who would win, who would lose, who would be made to do the challenge, and the challenge would often be sort of designed around them. And they wanted the end was for the whoever won or was going to win would go in a pram, slightly dressed as a baby, I think. And I don't know, things were thrown at them in the pram they had to catch or something. And it was given to me because I knew John Peel a bit from my days doing music, and also when he was a TV critic. He was a TV critic for the Radio Times, and he was one of the people who championed the Fast Show, and it was down to the likes of him that we managed to get a second series. So, because Vic and Bob, whilst on stage they could be very brave and do what they liked, off stage they were less brave, and they get other people to do the dirty work, which was often me. So it was,
oh no,
ask John Peel if he'd be okay to do this, the physical thing at the end. And of course John Peel said, no, I really don't want to do that. Sounds quite embarrassing. It's not my sort of thing. I said, oh, you'd be all right, John. And he really didn't want to do it. But of course, then in the heat of the moment, when he'd gone through the whole show and the energy of it, he did do it, and he loved it.
Wonderful.
So,
It is wonderful.
Destroyed your friendship.
Yes, yeah. But often there would be guests on who you just didn't get into it and didn't like it and didn't hate it. And in retrospect, there were a couple of things that they did which were a bit off that Vic and Bob did to the guests.
We mentioned Bang Bang briefly. Of course, that was next, where I think you were script editor on that one, and again some great performances.
Yeah,
most notably
very
Pat Butcher.
thin scripts. My job on that was just, do you think you could actually write it? Rather than, well, there's too much. What are the best bits that we can do?
How do you edit their scripts?
Yeah.
So it was, again, it was just being there in advisory capacity as much as anything. But I did get to do a couple of performing bits. The Monkeys sketch seems to be an enduring favourite.
It's got to be my favourite of all time, I think.
Yeah, which so there were some moments in that series that were absolutely sublime, but I think that the stuff they did in the studio wasn't as strong as what they'd done before, because it wasn't as rigorously worked out. They'd got not exactly lazy, but they were probably a little bit tired. They'd been doing the stuff for so long, and they were relying on, well, we know that's funny. I mean, they did also rely on quite a lot of quite well done physical stunts and things, like when they were hitting each other with the pans and they get the faces stuck on and things like that.
Yeah.
It was an amazing guy who did all the special effects and made those props and blew things up, who was called Steve. I wish I could remember his name.
Good old Steve.
I actually met him recently. He turned out to be a friend of a friend, and he just loved it. And he was great at making things as they had designed them. I remember on Cox and Evans.
That was the smell. Yeah,
that was
the smell. Yeah.
We were filming down in Hastings, and they had these Cox and Evans novelty dustbin things.
Yeah,
which Steve had built. And they were beautiful things, and they were down on the seafront. And the sketch called for them to malfunction and start smoking and blow up. And obviously, you need to get permissions to do these things, and you'll say, "Well, it'll be a small control." And Steve would say, "No, it won't be a small explosion. It'll be fucking amazing." And he nearly blew up the whole of Hastings seafront. An almighty bang. But he just loved doing that stuff. Steve Webster, brilliant man. And so he had a big input on Bang Bang of making all that stuff and making it all work.
Did you say the stuff on film, like The Club, which obviously
that was
led on to Catterick, which we'll get to eventually. Rupert the barman, I think you were in that. He was an interesting guy.
Yes. Well, I did the narration, and I did an act on stage. A man pulling
the
levers
ducks
on a big
or
machine
geese.
while a load of geese wandered around. And yes, I was the barman. But again, that's another one of those bits of filming we did, because it was largely improvised, and I couldn't stop laughing. And I tried to kind of work that into the character as if that's what he was doing. He was just giggling, but that was just me giggling.
It's mainly because of Bob's elaborate wind breaking during those.
There was
sketches.
that, and everybody was kind of doing bits and pieces. Morwenna doing stuff, and twitching, and
yeah.
But yeah, you know, some really, you know, stuff like that in Bang Bang was really funny and really strong. But yeah, I felt it was slightly not as strong in the studio stuff, a little bit thin.
And of course, the year after that, Randall and Hopkirk deceased arrived.
Again, they'd found out that Working Title had got the rights to the whole of the old ITC catalogue, all the stuff that Lou Grade made, and that they were looking at doing a remake of Randall and Hopkirk Deceased. And of course, you know, Jim's white suit had been directly inspired by the original Randall and Hopkirk Deceased.
Yeah.
Those people who don't know, it's two detectives, one of whom is a ghost, wears a white suit. And they got in touch and said, you know, if you are doing this, we would love to be Randall and Hopkirk. At which point it became a viable package. You know, they were big enough names, and it became, oh yeah, I can see that. Yeah, so managed to get it up and running. They asked me if I would produce it, because again, they wanted me to sort of be, actually no, they asked me to write the pilot, and then on the back of that, everybody seemed to like it. It was like, would I be producer, because they wanted me to sort of, because we trusted each other. I ended up directing some of it, and also acting in it. I took on way too much. It nearly killed me, but it was huge fun to do. And you know, I was trying to bring back, as were Vic and Bob, the shows that we'd loved in the 60s, when UK TV made all this imaginative, out there fantasy stuff. Shows like The Prisoner, The Avengers, Randall and Hopkirk, Adam Adamant, The Champions, what was it called, Jason, Department S, you know, Doctor Who. There were all these out there shows which disappeared by the 70s, and everything became a realist kitchen sink drama. And we've never gone back. We've never refound that, making that fantasy stuff. You know, the Americans carried on doing it, lots of making their big sci-fi shows and fantasy shows and high concept shows. But Britain, it became, if it's not realistic, it must be shit, or it's for kids. So we really wanted to bring that back, and I just thought, this is a great opportunity. We've got Vic and Bob, we can have them at the heart of these mad shows, and just have a lot of fun. And you know, I could write it tailored for them, knowing what their strengths and weaknesses were. And really it was Vic and Bob in Randall and Hopkirk. They weren't, I didn't want them or need them to kind of play anyone other than themselves. I know Bob struggled with it, and particularly in his autobiography, he's talked about how hard he found it. And it was partly because he suddenly thought, oh, I better try and be a proper actor. And perhaps a couple of the directors did try and sort of push him more in that direction, which wasn't what we needed. It worked better if it was light and everything was on the surface. And he wasn't comfortable doing that stuff. I mean, I think he comes across as much better than he thinks he was.
I think so. Yeah.
But I think he's still a little bit embarrassed about watching it. And you know, there was a bit of backwards and forwards when we first did it as to who should be the dead one, the ghost. And you know, I kept saying, well, it has to be Jim, because he's known for wearing the white suit. But actually, I think in some ways it might have been better the other way around, because in the series the ghost is kind of like, he's kind of like the serious one trying to sort stuff out, and the living one is the guy who's a bit more wacky and adventurous. So we had to have it that Bob is more, the living one is more sort of down to earth, and the ghost is the wild one, which works on many levels, because it meant that we could put Vic in this slightly mad environment and have fun with Tom Baker and all that kind of stuff. But it meant that Bob had to do more of the heavy lifting, which I don't know whether it might have been better if Jim could have been just this daft bloke getting into scrapes and Bob is trying to help him.
Yeah, there was that weird love triangle as well thing going on.
Yes. Yes. Which I think is there in the original.
Yeah.
And you know, again, it was Jim and Amelia that got it on with each other. Well, which is right, because they had been married in the show. But yeah, I mean, Bob found that all a little bit difficult and uncomfortable doing that side of things. But I think he did acquit himself well, and I know I'm really proud of what we made, and that it was quite different to everything else that was happening, and we managed to get an amazing cast of actors to come on because they all felt the same way. They all wanted the chance to do something a bit more out there and a bit more daft and outrageous and less intense.
You've got Stephen Burkoff and Derek Jacobi and people like that, and again you have a lot of the guys you work with. Nearly all the Fast Show cast are in it at one point or another.
I think I gave parts to all of them, and half the League of Gentlemen, and Laurie and David Tennant, and really, really good people. Simon Pegg, because they all wanted to come on and have fun, and for the most part they did have fun. I mean, it's hard work making a TV show.
Yeah, and that's the thing with a show like Randall and Hopkirk that's so beloved by people, and it's such an iconic series. You know, there's always that kind of like, oh, I hope they don't shit on it. Not shit on it. But, you know what I mean?
That was an older generation. We were wanting to go for a younger generation. For people
exactly.
Who didn't necessarily know the show, and actually of that roster of the sort of 60 ITC shows, Randall and Hopkirk was good. It wasn't great. It wasn't like The Prisoner or The Avengers.
Yeah.
Wow, this is just fabulous. It was a good workmanlike thing, and you know, and I don't know whether I made a mistake, because the controller of BBC 2, Peter Salmon, he said to me when we were putting it together, he said, "Charlie, just make sure that it's a proper solid detective show. We've got a strong detective mystery each week, and because people are familiar with that, and to go with that." And I probably wrongly thought, I've got a show with Vic and Bob where the two detectives, one of them's a ghost. We can make it a bit more out there than just a detective show. We can go off anywhere we want. But actually, you know, we might have been able to carry on with it if I'd made it much more of like the original was, which was just solving a crime each week, and he would use his skills as a ghost to help solve it. But I wanted to do more with it and send it into more fantastical realms, and that's bits that I really loved making, and which I think people now probably enjoy. And when it came down to it, as I say, you know, there are limitations with Vic and Bob. They're always only going to be Vic and Bob. And so I just wanted to make it, you know, their world. But you know, I had sort of rules a bit like the original Avengers, of there's never any scenes in it of anyone just walking down an ordinary high street. There's no jeans and trainers. It exists in its own little bubble, which is what they did on the Avengers, mainly because they couldn't afford crowd scenes and things. But it's a slightly airless world that it takes place in, and you know, I loved creating that.
I mean, the scenes in Limbo with Tom Baker are just the standout scenes for me. I mean, what was it like working with Tom?
Well, they were fabulous, and they had great fun with each other, and they both made each other laugh. I mean, pretty much all of Tom Baker's scenes were shot on a blue screen studio, so it was just a blue floor and all blue walls all around them. There would be bits of furniture, and you know, it came to me again to say to Tom, okay, well, this is going to be this room, and it's got these sort of weird sliding walls, and there's a door here, and Jim will appear as a sort of ethereal thing, and it come down, and he'll appear there. And he said, "I don't understand any of that fucking shit." Just tell me where to stand. I want to stay. I'll
Have that on Doctor Who.
I'll do my fucking lines. There we off. And I'd say to him, yeah, okay, so your job in this is to describe how the afterlife works and all this stuff to Jim. He said, I don't understand this fucking dialogue, Charlie. It doesn't matter. I didn't understand any of the stuff from Doctor Who, but I can do it. I can reel it off like squirrel shit. Oh yeah, and I'll tell it. You'll believe it, but I won't have any idea what I'm talking about.
He's fantastic.
And he was absolutely, brilliant. And he bought into it, and it was great of doing a show like that, which is large elements of fantasy. The actors have got to commit to it, and they all did. They all loved it. Derek Jacobi was a dream to work with. Being a slightly mad character who built an Amazon rainforest underground. And yeah, he gave it absolutely full commitment, and that just made it so much easier for everybody else involved. So yeah, great fun to make.
And it led on to the revival of those Saturday night sci-fi shows. I mean, you were followed, I think it was Primeval, Merlin, Robin Hood, which is not sci-fi but fantasy.
Yeah,
and of course, then Doctor Who, which is still going.
Those are all, those are all kids shows in a kids slot. That's the thing.
Yeah,
and in fact, a lot of the people who worked on Randall and Hopkirk were Doctor Who types, because I needed people who understood storytelling and drama, but also sci-fi. So, a lot of them had worked on the Doctor Who books, like Mark Gatiss and Gareth Roberts. People like Mark Gatiss and Gareth Roberts. And also we had Murray Gold doing the music, who went on to do Doctor Who. We had David Tennant in the first episode. There was a lot of talent on Randall and Hopkirk that went on to work on Doctor Who, and I was really pleased when Russell Davies got it so right with the relaunch of Doctor Who, and people enjoyed watching fantasy again. He had to do it in the guise of being a kids show, or at least a family show. But I think on the back of that, some of that talent has gone on. He's done things like, it's called Years and Years, which again has a sort of a sci-fi element to it. So, but still, anybody in this country who wants to do fantasy stuff, they pretty much have to go to America or to streaming services. Something like Good Omens. Huge amount of British talent in that, but it's it's not a direct BBC commission.
Yeah. And the most recent show I think you've done with Vic and Bob was Catterick, where you
that's very recent.
Well, it's 20 years ago, I suppose, isn't it?
In the grand scheme of things.
Catterick. We played Pat the Publican, who had his own catchphrase, which was hand.
That one really caught on.
Oh, that's a classic.
It mainly revolved around...
You don't get people shouting that to you in the street though, Charlie.
There's some people did respond to the spatchcock chicken element.
Oh yes.
That was a lot of fun to do, and Vic and Bob had a lot of fun making it, and I think it was a project that was very close to their hearts.
Yeah.
And again, they got in all the people that they loved and thought were funny. Moena, Reece Shearsmith, obviously Matt.
Tim Healy's great in that.
Yeah, Tim Healy.
Yeah, Mark Benton.
Great cast. And there's a lot of great stuff in it. And I don't know what else to say about it.
But you weren't behind the scenes of that, or were you just front of house?
No, I don't think I saw the scripts, so I'm probably gave a bit of input on the scripts. I don't think I was officially a script editor on it, but I wasn't involved in the filming other than the days when I was up there.
Yeah, I'll tell it like you were in something since then, which was, I think you're in one sketch in Monkey Trousers, which they're ITV.
I was a vampire sketch of some sort on Monkey Trousers.
Oh, the one you were in one with Bob with his croc botherer character, which was like a Steve Irwin.
Yes, that's right.
Character.
Maybe I did 2 sketches. or
Maybe
maybe
I
he
missed
was
that one.
being bothered by vampires. I can't remember.
But that was another attempt at primetime TV, which I think didn't quite work.
Well, their world is their world, and it's difficult often for other people to interpret that. And I think one of the strengths of the Fast Show was the fact that although Paul and I were the main writers and we produced it, all of the rest of the cast were writing, and we had other writers. So we had a large team of writers on it. It meant it wasn't so much work for the two of us, and it meant that the comedy was quite diverse. I think in the end, Little Britain suffered from the fact that it was just Matt and David writing it, and it was just them performing it, and that's hard work to sustain.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Sustain that. The problem on the Fast Show is holding all that talent together. Everybody's pulling on, wanting to go off in other ways. So yeah, Vic and Bob writing a sketch comedy, they had really good talent involved in the performers, and I think some of the performers did have some input in the writing. It's hard to pull off a sketch show.
That's why it's been abandoned.
Well,
what is it with you and monkeys, Charlie? They've just followed you through your whole career. It's just
yes. Well, there's something
It's a
in
good
there
laugh,
funny
isn't it?
about that.
Obviously with the Higsons, back in the day.
Yes, I've done 3 things where the word monkey is
Yeah,
involved.
that's
Whether
a lot.
that is
It's a
being
lot.
followed by these
It's a lot of
whole
monkeys.
I don't know.
What is it with you and monkeys?
What is it with you and monkeys?
How would you sum up 30 odd years working with Vic and Bob? What is it?
Well,
meant to you?
it was a privilege and a pleasure, and it was great that we both hit a successful period at the same time. It was fun, and to be able to do things with them, which I did as a fan, and I got to know them as friends over the years. I haven't seen as much of them in the last few years. So our lives have gone in different directions, and we're geographically in different places. But it's always great fun to meet up with them and do the occasional thing together. So yeah, it's just brilliant to have been part of that, to have had occasionally get my face into one of the funny things that they did.
I mean, do you have a process for your writing, Charlie? Obviously, with the Young Bond books and obviously your novels recently. Are you one of these people that you kind of set time each day, you write for a certain amount of time each day? Or
Yeah,
when you're writing for Vic and Bob, how were you?
I do office hours if I'm writing. It's the only way to do it. If you're self-employed, unless you put in a strict structure, you don't do anything. And it's my job. So yeah, boringly, I come up to this office in the morning and I work till the evening.
You see yourself as primarily a novelist now who occasionally gets called upon to do acting jobs here and there?
I do more writing than acting. I mean, I'm still writing a lot of TV stuff and developing TV stuff. The last couple of years, my novels have been more prominent. The TV stuff hasn't, for one reason or another, has not been seen yet. And yeah, I mean, I did a bit of acting a few weeks ago, but I get called on to do little bits of acting, and often I'm busy on something else and can't do it. So I've had to turn down a couple of quite fun things, unfortunately. But
hopefully Jim and Bob will give you a shout to do a cameo in The Glove when it finally sees the light.
Well, they
day,
haven't yet. They haven't asked me to any of the read-throughs. But I do think they're going to have trouble making a film about someone trying to find Michael Jackson's glove in this day and age. So
yeah,
it might have to be about something completely different.
Well, we'll see when it sees the light of day.
At one point they were trying to find Rolf Harris's didgeridoo, but that fell by the wayside. And originally it was one of Gary Glitter's boots.
It's a trilogy.
The problem with light entertainment, it can turn very dark.
I can think of a number of Vic and Bob sketches where one of them has portrayed Jimmy Savile, or he has been
Yes.
name checked
I know.
through the
Yeah.
years, which don't get shown
Yeah.
so much nowadays.
They
Anyway.
knew. They obviously knew.
And there's a few guests on Shooting Stars. Episodes don't get repeated either, but we won't go into them.
Yes.
Anyway, on that dark note, thanks so much for joining us today, Charlie. It
Thanks,
really was
Charlie.
quite a boast.
Well, it's been great fun to dredge up some memories.
Thank you all for listening to this edition of Quite a Boast. Special thanks to Matt Lucas for permission to use the Peanuts music as our theme tune, and thanks to Ed Lewis for this edit. Thank you to Jake Chesham for permission to use the photo from his 1995 shoot of Jim and Bob in our various online locations for the podcast. And of course, thank you very much to Jim Moyer and Bob Mortimer, without whom this podcast, well, it just wouldn't exist, would it? Remember to check out Paula's Divine Comedians podcast as well, and to join the Reeves Mortimer Depository of Curious Stuff Facebook group. And I think you'll agree that really was a lot of fun. Goodbye.